In 1924, within the city of Hanover, Germany, as the waters of the Leine River began to recede, the citizens were forced to confront a sight beyond their most horrific nightmares. Hundreds of human bones and skulls were discovered in a single location. Welcome to the Killer's Record. Today, we take you deep into the case of Fritz Haarmann, the man known as the Vampire of Hanover. A man who turned human flesh into merchandise sold on the black market, feeding on the desperation of a starving city. Back in 1879, in the city of Hanover within the German Empire, a boy named Fritz Haarmann opened his eyes to a world devoid of warmth. He was born into a home where the atmosphere was perpetually thick with the scent of oppression and rigid control. His mother, paralyzed by a fear of the outside world's brutality, chose to protect her youngest son in a manner that defied all reason. She dressed the small boy in white lace dresses, delicate and feminine, clinging to the desperate hope that the sweetness of these garments would preserve his innocence and gentleness indefinitely. Amid the dim light of a room where cold winds whistled through the cracks of aging wooden windows, young Friedrich grew up in a haze of confused identity, guided only by the scratchy touch of lace in his mother's watchful gaze, a gaze that directed his every step to ensure he never strayed from the pristine white world she had constructed. However, this fragile sanctuary was frequently shattered by the colossal shadow of Olli Haarmann, his father. A man carved from rage, Olli viewed his son's softness not as a quirk, but as an unbearable stain on the family honor. Whenever Olli returned home to find Friedrich draped in clothes unbecoming of a male, his temper would erupt, shaking the very foundations of the house with terror. "You are not a man. You are nothing but pathetic trash that shouldn't have been born," Olli would bellow, his palms slamming onto the wooden table with a thunderous crash. Friedrich never fought back. He simply sat in silence, staring into the cracks of the wood with a hollow gaze, as if his soul had quietly detached itself and drifted away to a safer place. Year after year in that Hanover home, silence became the only language Friedrich truly mastered. He learned to be still when his father returned reeking of liquor and malice, to be still when his mother forced him into lace that rubbed his skin raw, and to be still when the neighborhood children mocked him as a fake girl. Every morning, he woke in the darkness feeling imprisoned in a stranger's body, a vessel his mother wanted to be a porcelain doll, but his father demanded be a hardened man. This contradiction did not toughen him. Instead, it slowly fractured him into jagged shards, until he could no longer distinguish which piece was his true self. By the early 1990s, Friedrich was 11 years old. His body began to change with the onset of adolescence, yet his mind was denied permission to mature. His mother continued the grotesque charade, draping his developing muscles and tendons in sheer fabrics and ribbons that grotesquely clashed with his age. His father's violence escalated. Verbal abuse gave way to fists and leather belts. "You will never be a man if you remain this weak," his father would scream, the belt cracking against Friedrich's back. Friedrich did not cry out or beg for mercy. He simply gritted his teeth, staring at the floorboards stained with his own blood, learning a dark lesson in endurance. School offered no sanctuary. Teachers viewed him with suspicion and disdain, unnerved by the way he stared out the window with a vacant, emotionless expression. Other students avoided him like a plague. Whispers of freak and mommy's doll followed him, while others looked at him with pure disgust. Friedrich never tried to explain himself. He retreated to the darkest corner of the classroom, writing in a notebook with a trembling hand. But these were not lessons. He was listing the names of his tormentors, scratching lines over them again and again until the paper tore. In his mind, a new voice began to whisper, not his parents, but his own. One day, they will pay. Between 1893 and 1895, Friedrich wandered the city, carrying wounds from the past that were far deeper than the scars on his back. Years earlier, he had been sexually abused by a teacher, a secret he was forced to swallow alone. This repeated victimization by an authority figure taught him a cruel equation, that love and pain were identical. As his body matured, this confusion manifested in a dangerous new form. He began to feel a sexual attraction towards same gender, but it was devoid of warmth or affection. It was a desire for possession, for control, a need to inflict upon them the same powerlessness and fear he had known all his life. He began stalking them from the shadows, watching them with an icy stare. On the darkest nights, he would approach them in lonely alleys, but most fled on instinct, sensing the predator within. Friedrich didn't chase them. He simply watched their shadows vanish and smiled. By 1896, Fritz Haarmann had not grown into the man society expected. He had become a foreign object his father could no longer tolerate. After a series of thefts and disturbing behaviors, he was sent to a reform school, a place built to straighten crooked timber. Behind high walls, in the stench of stale sweat, Friedrich woke before dawn to scrub floors until his hands were calloused. But he wasn't scrubbing away his sins, he was scrubbing away the last remnants of his conscience. He learned to wear a mask of indifference, obeying orders with a practiced fake humility to survive, like an actor rehearsing for the role of a lifetime. In 1898, his father's final attempt to forge him into a man was to enlist him in the 10th Jaeger Battalion, an elite infantry unit known for its iron discipline. Friedrich stood in his dark green uniform among young men filled with patriotic fervor, but where they saw honor, he saw only a new cage of regulations. The pressure of brotherhood only deepened his alienation. He looked at his fellow soldiers not with camaraderie, but with a mix of envy and revulsion. At night, while the barracks slept, Friedrich sat hugging his knees, staring blankly at the moonlight filtering through the iron bars. His body was present, but his spirit refused to be assimilated by the system. Inevitably, his mental instability led to a swift discharge. Branded unfit for military service, he returned home only to be rejected once more. His father turned his back on him with a final curse. "Even the army won't take you. You truly are worthless." The words no longer hurt. They simply extinguished the last spark of humanity within him. From that day on, Friedrich stopped trying to prove himself to anyone. He turned instead to find a place where he belonged. His path spiraled downward into the asylum. Diagnosed as a moral danger, he was cast into a stark white world of screams and vacant eyes. There, he was not a patient, but a specimen to be studied by cold, distant doctors. He answered their repetitive questions with silence, plotting his escape. With the secret aid of his mother, whose blind love remained his only tether, he fled to Switzerland, drifting for a time, before returning to Hanover at the turn of the century. The year 1900 brought a new century, and Friedrich returned with a new confidence. The institutions, the reform school, the army, the asylum, had failed to cure him. Instead, they had served as an excellent university of crime, teaching him patience, how to read people, and how to survive on the run. Then, in 1901, the final restraint snapped. His mother passed away. The loss of the only person who offered him tenderness, however twisted, severed the last chain holding back his darkness. Without her watchful eyes, his grief hardened into ice, and Friedrich had no reason left to restrain the monster inside. From 1901 to 1913, his life became a revolving door of prison cells and false freedom. He evolved from a victim into a professional criminal, mastering theft, fencing, and fraud. Prison was not a punishment, it was a networking event where he learned the mechanics of the law and the price of corruption. He learned that society did not reward the good, it rewarded the survivors. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hanover descended into chaos. As men were shipped to the front, the city was left to the vulnerable. For most, the war was hell. For Fritz Haarmann, it was a golden opportunity. Amidst the starvation, he discovered he could exploit basic human needs. While others scrapped for bread, Friedrich moved through the streets with black market meat and goods. Between 1915 and 1917, he weaponized hunger. Runaways and lost boys became easy prey. He didn't use force, he used a warm smile and the promise of a hot meal. In wartime, meat and shelter were worth more than gold. No one suspected the kind man who invited them in. Friedrich would watch them eat with a predatory intensity, his mind not on the war outside, but on the private war he was winning, the conquest of their bodies and souls. The Great War finally ended in late 1918, leaving behind a fractured Germany. Yet, for Friedrich, the collapse of order was the dawn of his true era. The Hanover train station transformed into a chaotic hive of desperation, teeming with deserters and drifters. Friedrich moved through these crowds with a quiet excitement, knowing that in such pandemonium, a missing boy would simply vanish into the smoke. However, his streak of luck eventually ran dry. Arrested for petty theft, Friedrich found himself in a stark interrogation room at the Hanover police station, facing an inspector who viewed him with contempt. But Friedrich did not cower. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confident whisper. He offered a deal, his freedom in exchange for secrets from the darkest corners of the black market, places the police could never reach. In the silence of that room, a devil's bargain was struck. Friedrich was granted the status of a Spitzel, a police informant. The inspector slid a cardboard ID across the scarred table. As Friedrich's trembling fingers grazed the official seal, the dynamic shifted instantly. He traced the edges of the card with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. His eyes, once dulled by oppression, sparked with a terrifying realization. He was no longer an outlaw, he was an arm of the state. Stepping out of the station into the heavy rain, Friedrich felt the badge pressing against his chest, a weight that felt strangely grounding. To him, this was far more than a piece of paper. It was an impermeable shield, a license that would allow him to walk among his victims without suspicion. As he gazed at the young boys huddled near the dark train tracks, a twisted form of mercy began to swell in his empty heart. He understood now that the law was no longer a weapon to be used against him. It was the very cloak under which a monster could finally hunt. In that same year, the rigid discipline of the past dissolved into the chaos of a new reality, a station flooded with refugees and runaway boys seeking a fresh start. For Fritz Haarmann, this terminal was not a transit point. It was a stage where he performed his greatest role, the guardian of the law. He moved through the crowd with an arrogant stride, the police warrant card burning a hole of pride in his coat pocket. His gaze did not sweep the platform to maintain order as his badge dictated. Instead, it prowled for the singular quality he craved most: total isolation. Beneath the flickering station lights, he would occasionally flash his badge, not to catch criminals, but to lure the lonely souls who had no one else to turn to in the shadows. Then he found him. Friedel Roth, a 17-year-old boy, stood clutching a small satchel as he stepped off the train. His shirt was stained with soot, the cuffs frayed from a long journey. He had arrived hoping to build a new life, but the sheer vastness of the station made him feel increasingly insignificant. His empty stomach grumbled in protest as he scanned the crowd for a trustworthy face. In that moment of vulnerability, a stocky man with a benevolent smile approached him, introducing himself as Officer Fritz Haarmann, and flashing his badge, the stranger spoke in a low, comforting rumble. "It's dangerous for you out here. Why don't you come back to my place for a hot meal?" Friedel, disarmed by authority in apparent kindness, slowly nodded. The attic room at Sellerstrasse 27 was a cramped, suffocating space in a dilapidated district, its walls coated in grease and the air thick with the smell of stale mildew. Friedel sat on the edge of the wooden bed while Haarmann prepared a simple meal. The atmosphere in the room grew strangely oppressive, the light from the oil lamp flickering violently as wind drafted through the window frame. Haarmann placed a plate beside the boy, then reached out, stroking Friedel's head with a gesture that mimicked comfort. Friedel froze. He felt a chilling coldness in the fingertips that grazed his neck. Haarmann said nothing more. He simply stood there, watching the boy eat with eyes that were completely void of emotion, as if he were silently appraising the quality of a prize he had just acquired. That night, behind the sealed door of the rental room, Haarmann made his move on his first victim. Friedel tried to recoil, sensing the sudden radiation of malice, but the thick hands of the man he thought was a savior locked around his throat with terrifying speed. Haarmann buried his face in the crook of the boy's neck, the scent of youth triggering a raw, long-suppressed instinct. "It will only hurt for a moment," he murmured against the ear of the terrified boy, whose eyes were wide with panic. Friedel tried to beg for his life, but his pleas were strangled in a throat already being crushed. In a climax of perversion, Haarmann did not rely solely on the strength of his hands. He employed something far more gruesome, the Liebesbiss, or love bite. With animalistic frenzy, he sank his teeth into the boy's Adam's apple, tearing through the windpipe while Friedel was still conscious enough to feel the final agony. Dark blood sprayed across Haarmann's hands and face as he savored the taste of a life slipping away, until Friedel's world finally faded into absolute darkness. Amidst the silence of the old tenement, the rhythmic footsteps of patrol officers echoed in the hallway. They paused right outside the door to smoke cigarettes, completely oblivious that behind the thin wood, something had been irrevocably altered. One officer glanced at the nameplate on the door, gave a knowing nod to his partner, and walked on to continue their rounds. Meanwhile, inside the room, Haarmann sat motionless on the floorboards, which were now slick with dark fluid.
He stared at the lifeless body before him, his hands slowly reaching for the butchering knife he had prepared. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the curtains, glinting off the steel blade, a reflection of a man who had been given implicit permission to destroy without interference. By the third day of Friedel's disappearance, his panicked parents arrived at the Hanover police station. They described their son in desperate detail, begging the officers for help. The only response was the indifferent sound of rustling paper. "Kids these days just want to run off for an adventure. He'll come back on his own," the duty officer muttered without even looking up. The rotting bureaucracy viewed a missing boy as a triviality compared to the civil unrest in the city. The parents' pleas were silenced by a wall of apathy. Even when a witness mentioned seeing Friedel leave with a man bearing a police badge, the information was immediately buried in a locked drawer. After all, that man was a valuable asset, an informant the police were not willing to lose.
It was 1919 in Hanover, a city shrouded in a post-war gloom where hunger was the only constant companion. It was here that Fritz Haarmann stumbled upon the key that would unlock the deepest, darkest recesses of his soul. In a small, dimly lit bar thick with cigarette smoke and the stench of cheap liquor, he met Hans Grans, a strikingly handsome young man with a cold smile and eyes burning with ambition. Grans was not just another drifter, he possessed an uncanny instinct for extracting profit from death. Grans entered Haarmann's life as a lover, but their relationship quickly mutated into a blood pact far more horrific than anyone could imagine. Haarmann, who had once hunted alone, driven by impulse, began to change. Under the guidance of this young man, he discovered that his dark desires could be transformed into tangible assets. Grans reached out, adjusting Haarmann's collar with a proprietary touch, staring deep into the hollow eyes of the older man, as if casting a spell to bring a beast to heel. The hunting grounds of the Hanover train station, once driven purely by sexual compulsion, evolved into a complex, greed-fueled operation. Haarmann used the gleaming police warrant card in his pocket to approach targets, while Grans assumed the role of the selector. Grans's gaze did not linger on the vulnerability or sorrow etched into the faces of homeless boys. Instead, it scanned for the quality of fabric and the condition of leather shoes. "Look at that coat," Grans would whisper softly into Haarmann's ear, pointing out a teenager who had just disembarked, dressed slightly better than the rest of the ragged crowd. Haarmann remained silent, offering only a slow nod, acknowledging a target screened for profit. Grans became the catalyst, pushing Haarmann to cross old boundaries into a new realm of lucrative violence. Every disappearance from this point on was not just an extinguishment of life, but the conversion of a human being into cash within the black market they built together amidst the city's starvation. Within weeks, the list of the missing in Hanover began to stretch like an endless ledger of doom. Fritz Franke and Wilhelm Schulze were among the first to be dragged into the secret lair in the red light district. Franke, a boy with a bright smile and hopes of finding work in the big city, met his end in a cramped, musty rental room. Haarmann didn't just use brute force, he exploited the trust garnered by his status as a police informant, luring these boys to follow him like sheep walking willingly into a slaughterhouse. Grans would often stand in the dark corner of the room, smoking a cigarette, watching impassively as Haarmann buried his teeth into a victim's throat with increasing proficiency. Every stifled scream and every drop of blood splattered on the wall became music to Grans's ears. To him, it meant new shoes, fine clothes, or even high-quality cheese and meat they would feast on the next morning without spending a single pfennig. Rumors began to seep through the dark alleys and under the bridges where the homeless and war refugees huddled for sleep. Stories of the butcher, a mysterious figure circling the train station, grew louder. People whispered about a middle-aged man with a kindly demeanor who left only emptiness in his wake.
Beggars who had seen Haarmann lead boys away into the shadows lowered their heads as he passed, the police badge on his chest a constant reminder that the law might just be a tool for the executioner. Haarmann walked the black market with confidence, selling clothes that still bore faint creases and stains from their previous owners to merchants who refused to make eye contact. Many in the city began to question the source of the cheap meat he sold during such economic ruin, but hunger forced everyone to keep their mouths shut. Silence blanketed Hanover, even as mysterious body parts began to accumulate in the Leine River, with no one daring to ask about the truth hidden beneath the water's surface. One night, amidst a torrential downpour, a victim lay gasping his last breaths on the soaked wooden floor. Grans showed neither panic nor pity. He calmly stepped over a pool of blood, reaching out to stroke the fabric of the expensive coat the dying boy was wearing with undisguised lust. "I want this coat. It's too beautiful to let it get stained," Grans said, his voice as casual as if ordering a meal at a restaurant. Haarmann, still intoxicated by the victim's final moments, found Grans's interjection about the coat jarring and discordant, like ice water thrown onto a fire of passion. Haarmann stared at his lover's face and realized a chilling truth. Grans never participated in the pleasure. He was simply waiting to butcher the benefits. Grans picked up a knife and handed it to Haarmann with empty eyes. Haarmann took the blade with a trembling hand, his feelings shifting. The flickering light in the room slowly died out, leaving only the sound of metal clashing in the absolute darkness.
At number 2 Rotoraya, a grotesque stench began to seep from the rat-hole apartment of Friedrich Haarmann. All through the night, neighbors were forced to endure a sickening rhythm. Chop, chop, chop. The relentless sound of cleaver meeting wood, punctuated by the bubbling of a large pot that spewed a murky, foul-smelling vapor through the cracks of his door. It was not the savory scent of beef or pork one might find on the black market. It was a cloying, sweet decay that churned the stomach, reminiscent of carrion left to rot. When a neighbor dared to shoot him a questioning glance about the overpowering odor, Haarmann merely twitched the corner of his mouth into a smile and nodded as if everything were perfectly normal. He always had a ready excuse: cheap meat from the black market that needed to be prepped for sale at dawn. The neighbor stared at the thick yellow grease congealing on the rotting window frame before looking away, unwilling to provoke a man who exuded such quiet menace. Haarmann said nothing more. He simply stood there, staring back with eyes so empty that the other man was forced to retreat. Whenever Hanover fell silent under the cloak of darkness and the biting wind from the river, Haarmann's silhouette would emerge, carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets with a bizarre tenderness, as if they held precious treasure. He walked down the creaking wooden hallway, his footsteps measured and careful, heading toward the banks of the Leine River that flowed sluggishly nearby. Dim moonlight reflected off the dark fluid seeping from the rims of the buckets, dripping onto the grass and cobblestones like indelible stains. Once he reached a secluded spot by the water, he would swiftly empty the contents into the cold current. There was only a slight splash before the indistinguishable chunks sank into the depths of a river that kept many secrets. He did this night after night, sweat beading on his forehead, even when the temperature dropped low enough to turn his breath into white mist. Haarmann would pause to inhale the night air for a moment before hauling the now lighter buckets back to his lair. One afternoon, the building's silence was shattered by frantic footsteps. A trembling boy burst out of Haarmann's slightly ajar door, his face pale as a sheet. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, no sound escaping but jagged breaths of sheer terror.
He nearly reached the stairs to the street when he slammed into the broad chest of Haarmann, who was coming up to intercept him, as if he had foreseen the escape. Haarmann did not use violence or aggression at first. Instead, he calmly reached into his oversized coat pocket and produced the gleaming police warrant card, flashing it before the boy and the neighbors who had begun to peek out in curiosity. "This boy stole my valuables. I am a police officer, and I am simply teaching him a lesson," he stated in a flat voice, laced with an authority that compelled the onlookers to turn a blind eye. The boy looked at the badge with utter despair. His shaking hand tried to grab the railing, but Haarmann gripped his small wrist with immense force, leaving red welts on the skin. Haarmann locked eyes with the watching neighbors, his gaze so hard and cold that no one dared to intervene. The door slammed shut and the lock clicked, sealing the boy's fate inside, leaving the hallway to return to its heavy silence. After that afternoon, no one ever saw a shadow of that boy again. All that remained the next morning were dark, reddish-brown stains seeping deep into the wood grain of the stairs leading to Haarmann's door. A female neighbor holding a broom paused, frowning at the mess with growing unease. Just then, Haarmann stepped out, looking unusually refreshed. He stopped on the stairs and spoke loudly for all to hear. "Just horse blood, spilled it everywhere. I just got a quota of meat to sell at the market. In this economy, we all have to hustle to eat, don't we?" He chuckled low in his throat, a sound that sent an inexplicable shiver down the listener's spine. The neighbor could only lower her head and sweep past quickly, letting Haarmann whistle his way out of the building, trailing that pungent, coppery scent behind him.
It wasn't until a Saturday morning, under a sky choked with fog, that a male neighbor cleaning the central drain below Haarmann's window noticed something white lodged in the clogged grate. Reaching down to rinse it off, he found a small bone fragment. It was curved and oddly shaped, unlike anything he had seen before. Tiny teeth marks were etched deep into the white surface, as if gnawed by something ravenous. He paused, examining it, the sound of nightly chopping echoing in his memory. But the gnawing hunger and soul-crushing poverty of post-war Hanover made denial easy. He comforted himself with a convenient lie. It must be a rib bone from a small foal Haarmann had butchered, just as he claimed. He tossed the bleached fragment back into the trash with the dirt and filth. High above, behind a shuttered window, Friedrich Haarmann stood with arms crossed, watching him with eyes that gleamed in the dark. On May 17, 1924, a summer day that should have been filled with brightness was instead tainted by the scent of mud rising from the banks of the Leine River. A group of children laughed and chased an old leather football under the sun until the ball rolled into a thicket of bushes exposed by the receding tide. A boy scrambled to retrieve it, but his gaze was arrested by a smooth, off-white sphere partially jutting out of the silt. Mistaking it for a smooth stone, he reached down to grab it, only for his fingers to slip into deep, hollow cavities. He froze as he pulled it free. It wasn't a stone. It was a human skull, stripped of skin and hair, its black, empty sockets staring back at him. The boy stood paralyzed, the football slipping from his other hand to sink slowly into the muck. However, when the authorities were notified, the response was not a cordoned-off crime scene, but a dismissive shrug of annoyance. Probably just scraps from a medical lab or some grave robber's leftovers, an inspector muttered, nudging the skull with the toe of his boot. The Hanover police, desperate to suppress public panic, buried their heads in comforting theories. Grave robbers, prankster medical students dumping cadavers, anything was preferable to admitting that a reaper was walking among them.
12 days later, on May 29, 1924, a second coincidence surfaced. Another skull was found not far from the first, then a third and a fourth in June. The dam finally broke when a group of boys fishing dragged a heavy burlap sack from the riverbed near a meadow. When the twine was cut, it didn't spill fish or garbage. Out tumbled dozens of human bones, defleshed until they were stark white. This time, the wall of indifference crumbled.
The roar of boat engines filled the air, belching black smoke as massive iron rakes were lowered into the swirling currents. A major dredging operation had become unavoidable. Every time the iron hooks were winched up, they brought with them not just algae or debris, but meticulously butchered human remains. Skull after skull was lined up on the grassy bank. Even more horrifying were the numerous pelvic bones, scraped clean of all flesh with the precision of an expert butcher. Inspector Retz's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, staring at the pile of white bones growing beyond count. A heavy silence blanketed the area, broken only by the sound of the flowing water, which seemed to be whispering the tragedies they had pretended not to see for years. Headlines screamed in bold black ink, "The graveyard in the Leine." The number of recovered fragments soared past 500, confirming a victim count beyond anyone's darkest imagination. Terror infected the city like a plague. Every door was bolted tight before sunset. Inside the station hall, Inspector Retz stared at a city map now riddled with red pins. "These bones are too clean, like they were stripped by a professional," he muttered to himself, using a magnifying glass to examine the nick marks on a pelvis, marks that revealed a knife skill that was chillingly precise. The moniker, the Butcher of Hanover, began to circulate among the angry, fearful crowds gathering outside the police station. They demanded to know how atrocities on this scale could occur unnoticed for years. Amidst the shouting and chaos, one man stood, blending into the throng. He showed none of the panic etched on the faces around him. His expression was placid, but his eyes held a glimmer of inexplicable satisfaction. Fritz Haarmann pulled his dark collar up to cover the lower half of his face before quietly backing away from the turmoil. The city's chaos didn't rattle him. It was the perfect smokescreen, allowing him to continue walking freely as the trusted police informant everyone relied on. That night, the currents of the Leine continued to flow sluggishly past the old stone bridge near Rotoraya. Lamplight from a rental window reflected on the dark water, while stray bone fragments missed by the dredging sank deeper into the riverbed. The long-absent smell of blood in the air had been replaced by the rich aroma of meat soup bubbling in a large pot within a cramped room. The rhythmic sound of a knife striking a wooden board echoed, chop, 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 piercing the silence of a terrified city. A man was expertly preparing a late-night meal. His fingers, stained dark red, slowly wiped a drop of blood from the edge of the wooden table. He turned to look at the shadowy corner where the clothes of his latest victim still hung, a silent trophy that no one else could see.
Around the same time the bones surfaced, another crisis gripped the city. Hyperinflation so severe that 1 million marks were worth less than the scrap paper littering the gutters. People were starving, their skeletal frames visible beneath threadbare clothes. Meat had become a luxury that even the middle class could only dream of. Yet, in this economic darkness, Fritz Haarmann moved through the crowds, looking unusually well-fed. He carried a large, heavy sack slung over his shoulder, a faint scent of blood seeping through the coarse fabric. No one questioned its origin. When stomachs are empty, morality is the first thing to be digested. Haarmann became the savior of the slums, appearing with cheap meat from unknown sources. Everyone willingly turned a blind eye, trading their conscience for a taste of protein they hadn't seen in months. In the bustling black market, where illegal goods changed hands in hushed tones, Hans Grans stood in another corner, playing the role of a dandy. He laid out fine wool coats and polished leather boots that looked brand new. These items were far too luxurious for anyone to own during wartime, and a keen observer might have noticed they were sized for teenage boys who had not yet finished growing. Grans stroked the silk linings tenderly before handing them over to customers paying with foreign currency or gold bars. The conspiracy ran like a well-oiled machine. Haarmann handled the meat, while Grans handled the possessions. They were converting the disappearance of Hanover's youth into tangible profit. Whenever anyone asked Grans where he got such exquisite clothes, he would simply smirk and wink, offering no explanation. The crowd's survival instinct ensured that curiosity was buried beneath the desire for material goods. Back at the apartment, the sound of a knife striking a thick wooden block echoed rhythmically into the hallway. The stench of raw meat left at room temperature mingled with the sharp smell of disinfectant Haarmann used to scrub blood from the floor. Friedrich Haarmann worked with expert efficiency. He calmly separated muscle from bone, trimmed away excess fat, and diced the flesh into neat cubes, preparing it for sale. Neighbors passing by would often hear him humming happily as blood splattered onto his face. Haarmann didn't view his actions as a crime. To him, it was resource management in an age of scarcity. He knew which cuts were the most tender and which parts needed to be minced to conceal any identifying features. Every piece was processed until it was unrecognizable, waiting to be served on dinner plates across the city. A local restaurant owner, struggling to keep his business afloat, took a package of meat from Haarmann's hands to inspect it. He pressed his finger into the pale pink flesh, noting its unusually fine texture and surprising softness. It didn't look quite like pork, nor did it resemble beef. He looked up at Haarmann with a frown. "What kind of meat is this, Herr Haarmann? The color looks unfamiliar." Haarmann replied in a low, steady voice, staring deep into the man's eyes. "It's the finest veal you'll find right now. Trust me." The owner paused. He looked at the meat again, then at the dirt-cheap price tag. He had little choice if he wanted to keep his doors open. Slowly, he nodded and counted out a stack of marks without another question. Haarmann took the money, gazing at the owner with a look bordering on pity, before walking away. The secret, disguised as food, began to spread into kitchens all over Hanover. Rumors of devil's meat circulated among those who noticed something amiss. Some claimed the meat bought from Haarmann had a strange, sweet taste, unlike anything they had ever eaten, and when cooked, it released a nauseating aroma that clung to the throat. But with death by starvation lurking so close, questioning the source was too risky. Everyone chose to lower their heads and chew, oblivious that the meat melting in their mouths was a fragment of a life, a missing boy whose family was currently weeping in search of him. The entire city was being nourished by the blood and tears of the lost. The serial killer hadn't just taken lives, he had forced the whole town to become accomplices in destroying the evidence, digesting it in their own stomachs. One afternoon, in a quiet apartment, a middle-aged woman was simmering a pot of soup made from black market meat to feed her children. The aroma of boiling broth filled the small room. As she ladled the soup into bowls, a metallic clink rang out against the bottom of the pot, a sound that didn't belong. She paused, fishing around with the ladle until she retrieved the object. When the dim sunlight hit the item in her spoon, her heart stopped. It wasn't a peppercorn. It was an old silver button from a student's uniform with a shred of thread still attached. "Mom, why is there a boy's button in the minced meat?" her young son asked innocently, blinking at the object. The woman didn't answer.
She stared at the button with trembling hands, memories of the news about a missing neighbor boy flashing in her mind like a hallucination. She looked at the bowls of soup sitting in front of her children. The meat, once appetizing, now looked like pieces of a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. A chill ran down her spine as she realized what was about to enter her son's mouth. She snatched the bowl away so violently that hot broth splashed onto her hand, but she felt no pain. Her eyes remained fixed on the boiling pot. The image of Fritz Haarmann smiling as he handed her the package at the market flashed into her mind. The true horror wasn't in the dark butchering room. It was in the realization that the entire city had unwittingly tasted death. She collapsed onto the floor, staring at the small button in her hand, now the sole witness to the secret hidden in the soup.
By early June 1924, a pall had settled over Hanover. Inspector Retz began to notice a recurring shadow lurking within the missing persons files. Every time a witness described the disappearance of a young boy, the name or description of one man appeared in the same breath: Fritz Haarmann. To the force, he was known simply as Haarmann, their most trusted informant. Retz stood in the darkened corner of the train platform, watching Haarmann blend into a group of homeless teenagers with a smile that was far too friendly. Retz wrote nothing in his notebook, but his eyes locked onto Haarmann's hand as it settled slowly onto a boy's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was the cold, calculating touch of a customer inspecting produce at a market. Tension inside the Hanover police station spiked when Retz decided to drag Haarmann into a dim interrogation room. Haarmann sat on the wooden chair, far too relaxed for a suspect. He adjusted the collar of his thick coat, staring back at Retz with eyes full of undisguised mockery. When pressed about his connection to the victims, Haarmann leaned forward and whispered in a low, dangerous tone, "Are you sure, Retz, that you want to open this drawer? Because inside, you'll find your boss's name on the payroll of my black market dealings." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Retz could only grit his teeth as Haarmann leaned back, whistling a soft tune that clashed violently with the gravity of the room. In the hallway outside, grieving parents clutched photographs of their sons, pleading for justice, but Haarmann, fresh from the interrogation room, walked past them as if they were ghosts. An old woman reached out, grabbing the hem of his coat, begging for news of her son who had vanished near his apartment. Haarmann stopped for a split second. He looked at the tears streaming down her face with dead, empty eyes, then curled his lip into a smirk without uttering a word. He continued walking, humming in his throat, leaving the family's last shred of hope shattered on the station floor. His coldness was so absolute that some officers had to avert their gaze, knowing that this useful asset held more power than the oath they had sworn to uphold. The subsequent raid on the attic apartment at number 2 Rote Rea was nothing but grand theater, scripted in advance. Retz led a team hoping to find crucial evidence, only to find a group of officers friendly with Haarmann already on the scene. These men conducted a lazy search, joking with Haarmann about the meat sitting on his table. They deliberately stepped over piles of clothes heaped in dark corners and feigned blindness to the strange stains on the freshly scrubbed floorboards. Haarmann stood with his arms crossed, watching this clean sweep with satisfaction. He lit a cigar, blowing a thin stream of gray smoke into Inspector Retz's face as Retz frantically rummaged through a wardrobe. Soft laughter echoed from the other officers, who treated the investigation as a ridiculous joke.
Inside a sealed office, a high-ranking commander slammed his hand onto the desk, scattering case files across the floor. He glared at Retz, barking an order with finality. "Stop this madness about Haarmann, Retz. He is our best informant. Go chase the vagrants off the streets. That is your job." Retz stood at attention, but inside he was trembling with suppressed rage. Justice in Hanover was being rotted from the inside out by what they called security. Everything was orchestrated to paint Haarmann as an innocent man wrongly accused, while new victims were dismissed as runaways no one wanted. The crushing pressure made Retz realize he wasn't just fighting a killer, he was fighting the very system that cradled this monster within the arms of the law. Finally, the cell door swung open. Haarmann stepped out into the afternoon sun with the swagger of a victor. In his hand, he carried an old leather suitcase the police had seized from his room. It was scuffed and worn, and a keen observer might have noticed where a name had been hastily scratched off, the name of a boy reported missing just a week prior. An officer walked up, slapped him on the shoulder with a smile, and handed back his whistle and warrant card. Haarmann paused at the station steps, inhaling deeply as he looked at the suitcase in his hand with gleaming eyes. He didn't head home. Instead, he turned toward the train station where the crowds were teeming. His grip on the handle tightened.
The cold wind whistling through the train station that night set the stage for an unseen tragedy. Hans Sonnenfeld and Ernst Ehrenberg, two boys whose fates were intertwined by cruel coincidence, encountered the man in the coat, the one with the kind smile and the reassuring police pin on the dim platform in rapid succession. The disappearance of two boys in a single night caused the missing persons ledger at the precinct to swell ominously. Under the flickering streetlights, Haarmann's smile grew bolder. He no longer saw people, he saw raw material waiting to be butchered. The entire city had become his personal hunting ground, a territory he was permitted to rule without question, shielded by the warrant card in his pocket. Haarmann's behavior escalated into an arrogance so reckless it bordered on a challenge to morality itself. He began to appear in public, wearing clothes far beyond his station. Yet a keen eye would have noticed the belts cinched too tight, or the small tears mended with mismatched pins. He even walked into the police station to deliver his informant reports, wearing the dark velvet suit of a victim who had vanished just a week prior. The duty officer glanced at the familiar fabric with a frown, but upon meeting Haarmann's cold, vacant stare, he chose to lower his head back to his paperwork without a word. That silence was a stamp of approval, allowing the executioner to walk out of the station, swelling with the feeling that he was above the law. He stroked the fabric of the dead man's suit, with fingers still trembling from the thrill lingering in his blood. Whispers of the Liebesbiss, the love bite, began to leak from the sterile quiet of the Morgen onto the pages of local newspapers. They described bodies found in the river with windpipes torn out as if hunted by wild beasts. Panic spread like wildfire through every blade of grass in the city. Parents in Hanover forbade their sons from playing football in the open fields. Windows once open to the breeze were bolted shut before the sun even touched the horizon. The bustling city turned into a ghost town of suspicion. Whenever a stout man rounded a corner, fathers would yank their sons close and quicken their pace, fleeing from the shadows stretching behind them. Haarmann watched this terror unfold from his apartment window, feeling an invisible power. The entire city was trembling because of his existence. The partnership between Friedrich Haarmann and Hans Grantz began to strain under the weight of the clothes piling up in the small room.
Grants was not just a lover, he was the executor of the dead's estate. He inspected the quality of trousers and shirts with the scrutiny of a professional merchant. One day, as they sorted through the gifts of death, Haarmann proudly handed Grants a pair of gray trousers, but Grants tossed them onto the floor with a look of utter disdain. Haarmann froze. His body went rigid, eyes widening in rage at the rejection. He stared at the trousers, then at Grants for a long minute without speaking. The room temperature seemed to drop instantly. That silence was louder than any scream. It was the moment where Grants's greed and Haarmann's madness began to collide, cracking the wall of secrecy they had built together.
Their patience finally snapped in the darkness of an alley behind the market. Haarmann barked violently at Grants when he saw him trying to sell the disputed trousers for a pittance. "That is the most valuable thing I got for you." Haarmann's voice cracked with fury. Grants didn't back down. He glared back with hatred and spat. "Don't be an idiot, Haarmann. You can just go get another victim, can't you?" Panic flashed in Haarmann's eyes. He roughly grabbed Grants' arm, dragging him deeper into the shadows of the building, terrified that someone might have heard what they just said. Dim moonlight illuminated Haarmann's face, a mask of anger warring with anxiety. He patted the pocket containing his warrant card as if it were a life-saving talisman. Grants continued to mutter about the unfair split of the money as their footsteps faded into the darkness. Not far from where they stood, a young boy hiding behind a trash bin noticed something fall from Grants' pocket. It was a bone button with a strange, intricate pattern. He reached out to pick it up, unaware that he was holding a crucial clue that had slipped through the cracks. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, chasing after Hans Grants, the partner and lover who had just stormed out, leaving behind a trail of cutting insults. The conflict between them had escalated daily. Grants, paranoid about the growing scrutiny from the police, refused to fence any more clothes from new victims on the black market. But for Haarmann, these warnings were nothing but background noise. The stress from their fights didn't deter him. Instead, it acted as fuel, stoking the hunger inside him into a roaring flame. He needed to vent his frustration, and there was only one way he knew how to find peace. Haarmann tightened his coat against the June night and plunged into the darkness, heading for the Hanover train station, a hunting ground as familiar to him as his own backyard. His eyes scanned the thinning crowd for a target until they landed on a plump, well-dressed 17-year-old, Eric de Vries, an innocent boy from the countryside looking for work. Eric's eyes were filled with hope and a naivety that clashed violently with the rotting atmosphere of the big city. Haarmann flashed his trademark salesman smile, the benevolent face of a guardian of the law, and walked straight toward his final victim with an overdose of confidence.
The old lines that had worked countless times before were still potent. Haarmann led Eric through the old town without fear of being watched. Despite the rampant rumors of human bones, he brazenly marched Eric through the front door of his building and up to his room in plain sight. His hubris had completely blinded him to caution. He believed the fake badge in his pocket and his reputation as an informant would protect him as they always had. Eric followed the kind police uncle up the creaking wooden stairs. Once the door clicked shut, the friendly atmosphere evaporated instantly. The faint, coppery scent of blood embedded in the floorboards made Eric uneasy, but before he could voice a question, Haarmann's massive frame lunged at him. The pent-up frustration from his fight with Grants was unleashed in a burst of violence. Haarmann didn't just want to kill, he wanted to possess and destroy. In a climax of madness, he buried his teeth into Eric's throat. The kiss of death, the signature of the monster, tore Eric's breath away forever. Silence returned to the rental room. The body of Eric de Vries lay motionless on the floor. But what was different this time was the pile. Haarmann looked at Eric's suit and luggage with irritation. Because Grans refused to be involved, Haarmann had no outlet for these stolen goods. Eric's clothes were tossed onto a mountain of garments from previous victims that was now piled so high it nearly touched the ceiling. The room, once a perfect slaughterhouse, was transforming into a massive evidence locker. Haarmann threw himself onto the bed, panting with exhaustion, thinking he would deal with it tomorrow.
June 22, 1924. 8 days had passed since Eric de Vries drew his last breath. Inside the attic room at number 2 Rotraya, the horror had intensified to a suffocating degree. The stifling June heat reacted with what lay hidden. A pungent stench of decay began to seep from every crack, mingling with the musty smell of the mountain of clothes Haarmann still couldn't offload. His rift with Hans Grans had severed his trade routes in the black market. Haarmann lived among these corpses and incriminating evidence with a paranoia that gnawed at his mind. Yet, at the same time, the hunger of the beast began to scream again, as if Eric's death a week ago had merely been an appetizer. Haarmann tried to sleep, but the visions of his victims' faces and the deafening silence forced him to rise, dress in his favorite coat, and step out of the room, heading toward the Hanover train station once more. The night atmosphere of the station was still bustling with shadows and the faint steam from locomotives. Haarmann moved through the crowd with an inflated sense of self-assurance. He still believed in his fake badge and the persona of Detective Haarmann he had crafted over the years. His gaze swept the platform until it locked on to a young boy, Carl Fromm. A runaway with alert eyes, Carl didn't look like an easy victim, but for Haarmann, in this moment, caution had been replaced by negligence and a desperate need to find someone on whom to vent his lust and rage. He approached Carl with the same friendly smile, starting the conversation with an offer of food and shelter, hoping to use the same old tricks to lure the unlucky boy back to his death chamber. But what he didn't expect was that Carl Fromm was not a naive, starving child. The boy resisted, rejecting the offer with a defiant tone that sparked a violent displeasure in Haarmann. An argument erupted in the middle of the station hall. Carl Fromm tried to walk away, but Haarmann wouldn't let go. He gripped the boy's arm tightly, the anger accumulated from Grans's abandonment exploding onto the victim before him. Haarmann began shouting at Carl, accusing the boy of being a thief and a vagrant without papers. The commotion drew the attention of passers-by, but instead of feeling shame, Haarmann felt like an enforcer of the law doing his duty. He believed wholeheartedly that no one dared challenge him, and that every cop in the city was his ally. His arrogance blinded him to the warning signs. When he spotted a patrol officer walking by, Haarmann made the stupidest decision of his criminal life. He waved the real policeman over to help arrest his own victim. "Hey, officer, over here! This boy has no ticket and is acting suspiciously. I am taking him into custody for questioning," Haarmann barked with the tone of a superior.
However, the look the officer gave him was not filled with the deference or familiarity of the past. The loud rumors about skull fragments in the Leine River and the suspiciously cheap meat Haarmann sold put the police force on edge for some time. The officer looked at the agitated, disheveled Haarmann, then at Karl Fromm, who was trembling with fear, but steadfastly claiming his innocence. Instead of handing the boy over to Haarmann to handle as usual, the officer made the instinctual decision that would change everything. In that case, let's go have a chat at the station, both of you. The words hit Haarmann like a sledgehammer. He froze for a moment, trying to explain and cite his informant privileges, but the officer wasn't listening and ordered them both to march to the station immediately.
In a holding cell at the Hanover police station, Haarmann was separated for interrogation. His confidence began to shake when he realized the officers were no longer treating him like a colleague. The questions fired at him began to dig deep into his activities and the missing boys. Haarmann tried to spin deadpan lies, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of undeniable worry. Not because he feared the law, but because he was thinking of the room he had just left. The room that wasn't securely locked. The room with Eric DeVries' clothes and a mountain of others piled high. The room with pieces of unfinished meat sitting on the table. Being detained tonight meant his fortress was unguarded. As the iron bars slid shut, locking him in darkness, Haarmann could only pray for morning to come quickly. In the pre-dawn hours of June 23, 1924, while Haarmann sat restlessly in a holding cell, a special investigative team led by Inspector Retz arrived at number 2 Rote Raya. The silence surrounding the building was eerie, broken only by wind whistling through narrow alleys, carrying with it a faint, sickly stench of decay. Police pried open the door to Haarmann's attic room and pushed it wide. As soon as the beams from their lanterns and flashlights cut through the darkness, the scene that greeted them made even the battle-hardened Inspector Retz recoil, his hand flying to cover his nose. A wave of old, layered blood hits them, a copper tang so thick it could be tasted, mingled with the musty odor of the mountain of clothes. It wasn't just a few outfits, it was a chaotic heap of suits, trousers, and shoes belonging to countless young men, discarded like a graveyard of ownerless garments, piled so high they nearly brushed the ceiling. Officers began to sift through the mound with grim caution, and what they found was undeniable proof. A coat embroidered with the name Eric DeVries, the latest victim who had vanished just a week prior, was buried in the pile, along with his luggage. Beneath their boots, the wooden floorboards were stained a deep, dark brown, the blood having seeped so far into the grain it had become part of the wood itself, surviving endless scrubbing. Dried splatters marred the walls. On a work table that doubled as a butchering block, razor-sharp kitchen knives were laid out in neat rows. Most nauseating of all were the buckets in the corner. Inside, they found fresh meat, cubed and prepped for the morning market. The officers exchanged horrified glances, realizing with dawning dread what exactly the citizens of Hanover had been consuming with such relish during the economic crisis. Crucial evidence was rushed to the forensic lab immediately. An expert pathologist compared the tissue samples from the apartment with human muscle structure. The match was shockingly precise. But the horror didn't end there. Medical examiners revisited the skulls dredged from the Leine River, placing them under the unforgiving lens of a microscope. They found a detail previously overlooked. The hyoid bones and windpipes bore fractures consistent with immense localized pressure. When these injuries were compared against the shape of a human jaw, they fit perfectly. The pathologist's hand trembled as he penned the conclusion. The killer did not use a weapon. He used his teeth to tear the victims' throats out. This killing technique was immediately christened the Liebebis, or the love bite. It was an act of perversion beyond the comprehension of a sane mind. Haarmann would embrace his victims in a lover's hold, burying his fangs into their Adam's apple, literally biting the life out of them at the moment of sexual climax. This revelation transformed Haarmann from a missing persons suspect into a monster in human skin. The forensic report landed on the police chief's desk the next morning, confirming the identity of the meat and the clothes. The evidence was irrefutable. The Hanover police, who had ignored this case for years, were forced to swallow the shameful truth. They had let a demon walk freely under their noses, and worse, they themselves might have dined on the human flesh he handed them. News of the House of Horrors on Rot Raya spread faster than wildfire. Crowds began to amass outside the police station, screaming curses and demanding Haarmann be handed over for a lynching. The city's fury reached a boiling point upon learning the truth about the meat they had eaten. Haarmann, sitting in the interrogation room at Hanover Police Headquarters, saw his fate sealed when Retz threw Eric DeVries' coat onto the table, followed by the forensic report confirming his deadly bite. Yet, instead of fear or remorse, Haarmann simply let out a long, bored sigh and leaned back in his chair. The eyes that had once stared at victims with lust now looked at the police with flat indifference, like a butcher caught overcharging for steak, not a serial killer of dozens. He glanced at the damning evidence and muttered, "It's just old clothes. Why are you making such a fuss over a man like me?" The death he had dealt to so many was finally circling back to him. But even in this final second, the Butcher of Hanover refused to bow to the truth. Inside the interrogation room at Hanover Police Headquarters, the atmosphere was not the heavy silence typical of a holding cell. Instead, it was filled with the rapid, ceaseless murmuring of Friedrich Haarmann. He sat on the wooden chair with an unnerving ease, posture relaxed as if he were chatting with an old friend over coffee rather than facing charges for serial murder. Inspector Retz sat opposite him, staring at the middle-aged man with the clean-shaven face and innocent smile, feeling a wave of revulsion crawl up his spine. Scattered on the table between them were stacks of files and photographs of fractured skulls. Haarmann didn't shy away from the images. On the contrary, he picked them up, examining his own handiwork with the eye of an expert critic, offering shameless commentary on his technique. "Inspector, you have to understand, I didn't intend to kill any of them," Haarmann said, his voice taking on the petulant tone of a wrongly accused child. "It was just a trance, a moment where love overwhelmed me and I lost control. Those boys, they were so soft, so beautiful." He leaned in closer across the table, his voice dropping to a nauseating whisper. "I just kissed them. I bit their throats gently to show my affection, but then they just stopped breathing on their own. It was an accident. You understand, don't you, Inspector? It was a love bite, not the brutal murder those reporters are writing about." The confession forced the stenographer to pause, his hands trembling over the keys. When Retz cornered him with evidence of the clothes and the buckets of blood found in his room, Haarmann dropped the innocent act and instantly switched modes to Master Butcher. He began to mime the butchering process with his bare hands in the air, explaining the deboning and filleting procedure as fluently as if teaching a home economics class. "People are just like cattle or pigs, Inspector," Haarmann said with a flat expression. "Once the soul leaves, all that remains is meat and bone. I handled all of them in that little room. Just one knife, separated the head, the arms, the legs. Simple." He recounted the disposal of the waste with pride, unfazed by the looks of utter disgust from the officers surrounding him. But the moment that nearly caused the room to explode in horror came when the inspector asked about the missing meat. Haarmann shrugged indifferently. The economy is terrible right now. Meat is scarce and expensive, so I shared. I gave it to the neighbors, made some sausages, sold it cheap. He paused, locking eyes with a young, pale-faced officer in the corner, and broke into a wide grin. Delicious, wasn't it? Tender, good flavor. The whole city of Hanover has been eating it. Don't look at me like that, Inspector. Meat is meat. As long as it's cooked, it's food. The words were an emotional grenade. Several officers had to excuse themselves to vomit as the reality slammed into them. They had likely been unwitting participants in a cannibalistic cycle. Still, the cunning Haarmann knew the death penalty was looming, so he played his final card, dragging someone else to hell with him. His expression shifted instantly from smiling to bitter and vindictive at the mention of Hans Grans. "I didn't want to do all of that alone," Haarmann shouted, his voice rising. "It was Hans. That little bastard told me to do it. He wanted the nice clothes. He wanted the money from their pockets. I did it because I loved him. I did everything he asked, and he abandoned me." Haarmann began to wail, dumping the weight of his crimes onto his young lover without hesitation. "Arrest him. He is the real devil. I was just his tool." Haarmann's betrayal was the final key to unlock the mystery. Inspector Retz looked at the killer performing his grand finale with cold eyes. He knew Haarmann was evil, but he also knew that Hans Grans had been complicit, pulling the strings from the shadows, just as Haarmann claimed. The interrogation ended with an immediate arrest warrant issued for Hans Grans. As for Haarmann, he was led back to his cell with a smirk on his face, the smile of a victor who knew that at the very least he wouldn't die alone. He was dragging the person he loved most to the executioner's block right alongside him.
It was late 1924 in Hanover. The atmosphere inside the city courthouse was thick with tension, heavy enough to choke on. The echo of police boots striking the floor reverberated through the grand hallways, punctuated by the relentless flash of old cameras like an unending thunderstorm. Every eye was fixed on the stocky man striding into the defendant's dock with a composure entirely unbefitting a serial killer. Friedrich Haarmann didn't look like the monster the world feared. Dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, he nodded greetings to acquaintances in the crowd like an actor making his grand entrance onto a stage. Haarmann scanned the room with a faint smile, knowing full well that the secrets he had buried beneath the Leine River were about to be unfurled for the entire nation to see. The trial began in chaos as Haarmann turned the courtroom into his personal theater. Showing not a shred of remorse, he critiqued witnesses and recounted the butchering of bodies with the cheerful tone of someone describing a dinner menu. When the prosecutor asked about his motive for ending lives, Haarmann tilted his head slightly and replied in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, "I simply did what I had to do to preserve their innocence in my own way." The statement sucked the air out of the room until only the sound of stifled breaths remained. Haarmann turned to look at the mother of a victim sobbing in the front row. He held her gaze steadily, then offered a single wink without a word. This open display of cold-bloodedness caused the hands of reporters taking notes to tremble. They realized they were facing not just a murderer, but something that defied the definition of humanity.
Renowned psychiatrists were summoned to debate the defendant's mental state heatedly. Some argued he was a product of hereditary madness and a twisted childhood, while others insisted he was a beast fully aware of right and wrong, but choosing destruction. Amid the headache-inducing medical jargon and psychoanalytic theories, screams of curses from grieving families erupted periodically. They demanded vengeance, not a diagnosis. Haarmann sat listening to these arguments with palpable boredom, picking at his nails and feigning sleep. When it was revealed that Haarmann had operated freely for so long due to his status as a police informant, many officers in the room lowered their heads, unable to meet the public's gaze as the truth was laid bare. They had protected the man who was butchering human beings right under their noses. The failure of the Hanover police force inevitably became a co-defendant in the trial. Evidence showed that reports of missing boys were ignored simply because Haarmann was one of their own, providing intel on the black market and petty crimes. All the while, Haarmann used the badge they gave him to legally access victims at the train station. The rot of a system that allowed a demon in uniform to work shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement fueled public outrage. Crowds outside the court began lighting fires, chanting for delayed justice. Inside, Hans Grans, the young lover and accomplice, sat trembling beside Haarmann. Grans looked like a bird with a broken wing, ready to betray anyone to survive. Yet Haarmann reached out and touched his arm gently, a gesture of comfort without words, even knowing death awaited them both.
When it came time for Grans' verdict, the room fell into a terrifying silence. The court found him guilty of inciting murder for personal gain and sentenced him to death, as the mob demanded, though this would later be commuted to life imprisonment. In that moment, however, Grans collapsed to the floor. Haarmann watched the scene with empty eyes before turning to face his own fate. The overwhelming evidence of over 500 bone fragments dredged from the river, combined with forensic testimony confirming unspeakable brutality, left the jury no choice. Haarmann was found guilty of 24 murders, though everyone knew the real victim count likely exceeded 50. The number on paper was merely a fraction of the true horror he had left behind in the attic at number 2, wrote Raya. The judge adjusted his spectacles, his voice trembling slightly as he read the final sentence. Friedrich Haarmann, you are sentenced to death by beheading. He paused for a moment before adding the phrase that stunned the room. 24 times for the number of lives you have taken. Haarmann showed no fear. He simply straightened his posture slightly, as if accepting the crown of death he had long awaited. Turning to his lawyer, he whispered with a cold smile, "That's quite an expensive joke for my final journey. Tell them, on my grave, carve the words, 'Here lies mass murderer Haarmann.' It would look quite good, wouldn't it?" This verdict was not just about removing a criminal, it was an attempt to heal a deep wound in a post-war German society on the brink of collapse. The wooden gavel struck the block, signaling the end of the trial of the century. As guards led Haarmann out of the courtroom back to his cell, he rolled his neck as if testing the position for his head on the future execution block. The evening sun, filtering through a narrow window, highlighted his scars and wrinkles. He paused briefly in the shadow of the iron door, tilting his head up to stare into the void above with a look of strange anticipation. There was no shouting, no plea for mercy,
Only an oppressive silence radiated from him, leaving the people in the courtroom drowning in unanswered questions about human nature as the heavy door slowly closed, cutting him off from the outside world forever. April 15th, 1925. Dawn broke, but the first light brought no hope. It was merely the final bell for the man who had carved a massive scar into the heart of the German people. Within the dark, damp cell, Fritz Haarmann sat calmly on the edge of his narrow wooden cot. His wrinkled skin appeared sallow under the dying light of an oil lamp. He didn't look like the vampire or the bloodthirsty monster the newspapers had branded him. Instead, he resembled an ordinary middle-aged man waiting to embark on a long journey. The musty smell of the prison, mixed with the faint scent of cheap cleaning fluid, created a suffocating atmosphere, yet Haarmann inhaled it slowly. He seemed to be savoring the final sensory details of a world he was about to leave behind, along with the dark secrets that would never be fully unearthed.
Before his time ran out, Haarmann made a request, simple yet reflective of his enduring tastes: a fine cigar and strong Brazilian coffee. He sat sipping the coffee delicately, blue-gray smoke from the cigar curling into rings in the air, momentarily obscuring his expressionless face. The warden entered to announce the final schedule, but Haarmann merely offered a slight nod and a chilling half-smile. He seemed more like a spectator watching his own play than a condemned man. To the trembling warden standing outside the bars, he said simply, "This coffee tastes wonderful. It almost makes me forget where I'm going." Then he lapsed back into silence, letting the moments tick away as cigar ash drifted slowly to the cell floor. When the cell door opened for the last time, Haarmann stepped out with a composure no one had expected. He maintained the persona of the confident police informant he had once prided himself on until the very last second. His eyes didn't search for mercy. They scanned the narrow corridor as if he were inspecting it for order, just as he used to do at the Hanover train station. When a priest approached to offer last rites and asked if he had any message for God, Haarmann simply stared into the holy man's eyes without uttering a single syllable. The silence was so long and so cold that the priest was forced to look away first. Haarmann walked past guards who had once feared him, and perhaps some who had unknowingly bought cheap meat from him in the black market. Every step was heavy, steady, and devoid of any visible regret. The procession reached the central courtyard of Hanover Prison, where the guillotine, black and imposing, stood amidst the morning mist. The frigid air stung the faces of everyone present, but Haarmann stood still, staring at the massive blade catching the faint morning sun. He didn't flinch, even as the official read out the death sentence for 24 counts of serial murder. The butchery in the small apartment, the Liebesbiss marks on the victims' necks that earned him the global title of the Vampire of Hanover, and the tragedy of the Leine River. All was about to be settled by this blade. Haarmann looked around the courtyard, seeing the mix of hatred and fear in the eyes of the officials and witnesses. He knew he had become a living legend. In the moment he was led to the scaffold, the executioner's hands guided him onto the wooden board. Haarmann turned his face to look at the group of observers one last time, uttering words that would be etched into history. "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man." The executioner paused, waiting for the final signal, and asked one last time if he had any final words. Haarmann simply closed his eyes slowly and offered a faint, spine-chilling answer as his only answer. The blade fell. The life of the Vampire of Hanover was extinguished forever. Dark blood seeped into the cold ground, spreading in a wide pool,
like the fear that had once permeated the entire city. As the lifeless body was carried away, absolute silence replaced the final breath of the century's most notorious criminal. The execution was over, but the atmosphere in the courtyard did not lighten. Officials dispersed with a lingering unease. Haarmann's death might have ended the physical life of the perpetrator, but it did not close the wounds he had inflicted on German society. Some witnesses remained, staring at the bloodstain, wondering if the true evil had vanished, or if it had merely rooted itself deep within the dark corners of the city, waiting to rise again.
In 1925, in the city of Göttingen, after the blade had fallen, Friedrich Haarmann's body was not laid to rest in eternal peace. Instead, his severed head was transported to a university laboratory. There, expert neurologists carefully sawed open the skull to extract the pale gray brain, preserving it in a jar of clear formalin. For decades, they stared at it through the distorting liquid, clinging to the futile hope of finding the root of evil hidden within its convolutions. His brain became a scientific exhibit kept on a shelf as if the world wasn't ready to let the horror fade away. It remained there until it was finally destroyed in 2015. But even though the physical mass is gone, the haunting question remains suspended in the air. Are monsters born, or are they cultivated by a broken society? In the dark alleys of Hanover, the pitter-patter of children skipping rope is not always accompanied by innocent laughter. Instead, they chant a catchy folk tune with lyrics that slice deep into the psyche. Wait, wait, just a little while. Soon Haarmann will come to you. With his little meat cleaver, he'll make mincemeat out of you. This song echoes off the old brick walls, a chilling reminder of the paranoia that took root in the hearts of parents. The fear of the man in the trench coat who once walked unnoticed among the crowd, transformed into a grim fairy tale used to warn children to hurry home before sunset. To this day, the shadow of a stranger in a long coat still makes people avert their gaze. The turmoil and vengeful atmosphere of that era in Germany became the inspiration for Fritz Lang's 1931 cinematic masterpiece, M. The image of a child murderer hunted by both the police and the criminal underworld reflected a city collapsing under the weight of its own lost faith and justice. The scene where the protagonist is cornered in a dark storage room, watched by a merciless mob, is a direct reflection of Haarmann's trial. Audiences in theaters sat in suffocating silence, realizing with dread that what they were watching on screen was not fiction, but the fresh scar of a national nightmare they had only just survived. The building at number 2 Rote Raya, once Haarmann's private slaughterhouse, was eventually demolished to erase the physical trace of madness. But the empty street became a destination for pilgrims drawn to the macabre. They stand silently, staring at the void where the smell of blood and mysterious cooking smoke once hung heavy in the air. Though the bricks are gone, an oppressive feeling still clings to passers-by. Some stare at the remaining cobblestones as if seeking answers that will never come. Others imagine the shadow of a stocky man carrying buckets or baskets of meat passing them in the twilight. It is as if the ground itself has absorbed the pain of those teenage victims, a stain too deep to be washed away by the passage of a mere century. Haarmann's death led to a massive reformation of German police laws and procedures. The disgrace of allowing a serial killer to use an official badge as a shield was a costly lesson paid for with dozens of young lives. Reflecting on the tragedy years later, a witness who lived in the neighborhood looked at old photos of the police station and said, He didn't hide very well. We were the ones who left the door open for him." Those words strike at the heart of the matter, forcing us to look back at a post-World War I society where hunger and chaos blinded people to the devil walking beside them in the guise of a helpful citizen. Ultimately, Fritz Haarmann was not just a naturally occurring anomaly of madness, he was a symptom of a fractured era. A Hanover bruised by war and economic ruin created the dark cracks where a beast could thrive, protected by a failing system. His memory still flows in the currents of the Leine River, where hundreds of human skulls and bones once lay buried in the silt. The calm surface of the water today still reflects the shadow of the past, a constant reminder: when a society closes one eye in exchange for a false sense of peace, a new monster is always ready to step out from the shadows. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest corners of history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Killer's Record.